Welcome to ETHDam, to ETHDam, to ETHDam, to ETHDam, to ETHDam.
Hello everyone, I'm Reuben. I am the Project Steward of Firo. We used to be called Zcoin. We've been around since around 2016. So today my talk is about, fighting for the middle ground in privacy, because increasingly, we're going towards like very maxi views. One is like ultimate privacy, any sort of compliance is, an attack on individual user freedom. And on the other hand, you have this full compliance mode. They want to be very intrusive, give all your KYC data. And being someone in the privacy space, so I've been in crypto since about like 2012, 2013, and a little bit about myself. Before going full-time in crypto, I was actually a lawyer for 10 years. And then after that, I actually ran a VPN business, and I was cracked down. Even recently, like my bank accounts got frozen. So I've been on both sides, both on the regulatory side and on the side of, doing the right thing, doing legal things, but being on the fringe and being censored. So obviously, I see the benefit of both. So yeah, today this is about the talk of fighting for that middle ground, which often, was seen as sellouts. We're neither here nor there, but I want to kind of express why I think this is important. So now this fight is actually much more important than before, because like right now we have a bunch of really not really bad regulations, but regulations that are very intrusive. Like for example, okay, we have had the Financial Action Task Force, the travel rule. We've been around that. There are ways to navigate around that. That's already coming into force. We have the markets and crypto assets regulations, which specifically dealt with privacy assets, mixers, and coins. That's already mostly into force. And obviously now the big one, which I think you've probably seen in a couple of days ago, is like, oh, EU is banning all privacy coins, which is the anti-money laundering regulations, which I think is coming into force in 2026. Now, disclaimer, although I'm a lawyer, I am not an expert in this law. So, take this, ask your lawyers for advice on all of this. And this is actually quite scary, because we've seen just a couple, 1 or 2 years ago, we've seen crackdowns on Tornado Cash, Samurai Wallet. And a lot of people now with the Trump administration say, oh no, it's fine, everything's okay. The sanctions have been lifted on Tornado Cash, Samurai Wallet, the actions are being dropped against them. But it's actually something that's really alarming, because, well, first of all, it still hasn't been answered whether the developers are actually responsible for the money laundering through Tornado Cash. The only thing that has happened is to say that you can't sanction a smart contract. So those very key questions of whether the developer can be responsible hasn't really been sufficiently answered. And just imagine you have a change of administration. If Trump goes out of power or changes his mood or something like that, this all can change very, very quickly, right? And obviously this continuous infighting, Zcash and Monero people still hate each other. And it's we should be working together to come up with common standards to have a common front, but instead everyone's kind of crapping on each other, which privacy coins, privacy assets are already less than 1% of the market, and now we are fighting among a little piece of pie, which I think it doesn't help the whole thing. And we've seen just in the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen rapid delistings of privacy assets from many exchanges, like OKX. We saw Binance delist Monero. We got delisted very recently. And this is a trend that's going to continue, especially if we don't address a lot of this negative feedback that's addressed to privacy. So I know the words are a little bit small, but basically, in short, there is a privacy spectrum, right? One which it's maximal privacy, where we're not going to be playing with regulation. We build what we think is necessary. Mandatory privacy, no compliance whatsoever, and that's well, it's a position to take, one that I actually support. But there's also like the middle ground solutions, such as like Zcash, what people are doing with the railgun and privacy pools, and Firo, we've done something with like exchange addresses. And this is kind of like, well, we don't want to have like backdoors, we don't want very intrusive KYC requirements, we don't want to have like inbuilt KYC into like at the protocol level type of thing. But here we are still allowing exchanges some tools to make it easier for them to comply, because exchanges want to comply, it's basically a cost-benefit analysis to them, and we have to make tools easy for them to use. So that's kind of like the middle ground where we are not compromising to say like we're going to build a backdoor or something like that. Then obviously you have the, I guess the more regulated side where now, we want to see your flows. We will have certain keys that can open it if regulators want to see it. Everything has to be KYC and whatnot. I mean, sure, there are still use cases for this. For example, if you're institutional and things like that, that kind of makes sense. But I think for the average Joe, and it's also like very bad for UX and stuff like that. So yeah, this is kind of like just showing the spectrum. So again, as I mentioned, like privacy is becoming, very binary, and we kind of just want to, like, dismiss some of this myth, right? Because a lot of times you say, oh yeah, if you have transparent addresses, you're not a privacy coin, or if you have like a certain type of features, you are sell out to privacy, right? And that's not true. Like, even if you use Zcash or something like that, if you have the shielded transaction, it's pretty private, right? Sure, there are some ways that you can leak information, but it's not correct to say Zcash has no privacy, right? So this is like kind of silly. So another thing is that, oh yeah, we have to make everything transparent. Isn't that what blockchain is about? No, actually, because we didn't have the tech to enable privacy, which is why we have this transparency on blockchain, because we need that verifiability. But the thing that we actually really want, I mean, like I would say maybe 80–90% of people want, we want privacy for everybody, but we don't want bad actors, illicit activity to be actually used in this privacy thing. I mean, of course, there's some nuance, some activity may be illegal but not actually bad, but we don't want terrorists to be using it. We don't want like really bad sort of stuff being used for privacy. And the ideal, of course, maybe it's a bit utopian, it's a bit like naive, but it's a goal to achieve, right? It's something that we want to have privacy for the average Joe, for most people, but we want to keep bad actors out. So that, I would say, is the kind of goal that we should be aiming for. Now, obviously, because of this binary kind of talk, especially like, with, like Monero being the biggest privacy coin, they're, I think, also one of the loudest in the privacy space. There is kind of like an issue that when everything's becoming too extreme, right? So right now, a lot of these people like, okay, like Monero, DarkFi, they're like, let's totally abandon regulation. We'll build our own little circular ecosystems, where we cannot be stopped, we're uncensorable and all of that. And that's fine, that will continue to exist no matter what, but it will also be a much smaller crowd. It's going to be niche, right? And you kind of like become like little siloed liquidity places, very niche. And that's okay. But it also means that you deprive yourself from, having access to the masses. We have to understand that if a privacy coin has ramps to fiat and all of this, it makes it a lot more useful. There's a lot more liquidity on centralized exchanges. That's something that actually helps privacy adoption. But sure, we also should have this kind of like uncensorable things. But at the same time, whenever these type of tools get used for illicit behavior, and we can say, oh yeah, no, it's just the protocol, it's working as designed, we are actually feeling like this regulator saying like, oh yeah, privacy coins is used for illicit activity. Every time we see the, like privacy being mentioned in Cointelegraph or whatnot, it's always like, oh yeah, North Korea used this, oh, some hackers use that. It's never like, oh yeah, I'm sending something to my mom and I don't want people to learn. That's not newsworthy, but every time we see privacy, it's being associated with negative behavior. And because of this, we have very, very strict regulations that come on, they slap on. And it's actually like for example, like, South Korea, they ban like entire all privacy coins. Japan banned all privacy coins because of a hack of an exchange that was using a coin that didn't have privacy features. So it was called NEM. I think it was way back. And then they banned privacy coins even though there was no proceeds that were used to actually launder into any sort of privacy assets. So, we have to treat it, I think it's better to think of privacy in a more nuanced fashion. And we also have to realize that the opposite, to say, oh yeah, let's do like KYC, even if we talk about ZK KYC credentials and all of this, all of these solutions require someone to still hold your KYC details and credentials. They still can be hacked. It's a crappy UX. Every time when I want to use the exchange now, I'm like, oh yeah, look up, look down, open your mouth. It's not a great experience, right? So let's try to treat it like, in a kind of a moderate fashion where, yes, we trying to prevent bad actors. There may be some sort of blacklist that needs to be done, but not something that's super intrusive that we have to give out all our data. Now, another very common myth, especially those promoted on the more maxi side, is that, oh yeah, criminals use us because we work. I think that's a really horrible thing to be saying. First of all, it's giving ammunition to those that want to fight privacy to say, oh yeah, look, privacy advocates are all about, illicit activity, which is a very easy thing to fall into. And more importantly, it's not even true. Criminals use whatever is the most convenient and the most liquid. We have seen so many times, like the Bitfinex, like in 2016, the hack. I think they just used some like centralized coin laundry, which the people actually managed to trace the flows, right? Even like the Tornado Cash tag, they did like quite crappy with it. They kind of consolidated into one deposit address, which meant that even when they went through Tornado Cash, they still could be tracked. And even recently, like there's something called pig butchering scams where, people pretend to be pretty people and do some love scams. And they all were using USDT on Tron, right? Which had no privacy. So it's very clear that criminals just use what they think is good, not necessarily it's actually good, and they make a lot of mistakes, all this OPSEC stuff. So let's stop talking or championing any sort of use of criminals. Even if it's true, we shouldn't be championing it, and it's actually like a very small proportion of actual privacy usage. Now, just I wouldn't go into the details of like what exactly regulations require, but they require a whole bunch of things. Maybe some of these things are not right, but this is what the laws that are coming into force or are in force already, right? They want to know who you are. Basically, sender, receiver, right? They want to know where it's from. They want to show the transaction history, maybe the entire transaction history, right? They want to have blacklist checks, make sure it doesn't come from a sanction or hack funds and all of this. And they want people to keep records. So like that's it in a nutshell. And I guess like MiCA, FATF, MLR are like the kind of like main regulations that crypto companies are worried about. So this is just a brief overview, right? But the thing is that, some people are like saying, well, you come up with kind of like a compromise solution. When these new regulations come into force, maybe it would not be accepted. But the thing is that buying time has its actually own benefits, right? So because, centralized exchanges and all these swap providers and all of this, they still form, I don't know, 80, 90%. I mean, I'm plucking this figure out of the thin air, but I'm very sure that most of this still goes through centralized crypto ramps and stuff like that, right? And even if these compliance measures eventually fail, it buys time for us to build proper decentralized tools, right? Because we need time. These type of tools, especially more censorship-resistant ones, tend to be a bit harder to build because you have to have the P2P network, you have to have all this sort of censorship-resistant. It tends to be a worse user experience. You need time for people to learn, educate, and get used to it. So, but even those that are like currently, they claim censorship resistance, they're not as censorship resistant as they think they are. Often like, after we were talking about like Havana Reto that's being used by Monero, where all the arbitrators are run by the same admin keys, it's not ideal, right? So again, we would like to say like, yes, there are some compliance measures that may be a bit half, it may not last in the long term, but if it buys time, it is still some benefit towards it. An example of this is something called exchange and tax addresses, which was something that So Binance, I think, I can't remember the exact year, but they were under a lot of pressure from European regulators and also the Department of Justice to crack down on privacy coins, right? And they were on the verge of delisting all privacy coins. Even some of them fake privacy coins that didn't have any privacy, but like Verge, like it doesn't have any privacy. It's totally on-chain, but then because CoinGecko says it's a privacy coin, regulators say, yep, let's include that in the list, right? And then all these fake privacy coins say, oh, we're actually not a privacy coin. But I mean, that's a separate thing. But the thing is that Binance went through this list and started saying that, do you have any plans to remove your privacy? And they asked us, and we're like, no. And then say, okay, noted. And I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't look very good, right? And we were also trying to contact the other coins that also had like a similar thing, like Zcash, PIVX, and all of this. And Zcash was actually at that time pushing like, oh, Binance, why don't you use our view keys, that will comply and everything and all of this, right? But Binance wanted very clear things, and I'm not saying that that we should be listening to Binance and all of this, but this is the way their legal team at least kind of said that this is the way that we can kind of comply with MiCA, kind of comply with regulatory the concerns and pressure that's on them. And they didn't want any sort of direct touching of shielded funds. So that means, like, let's say if you have a Zcash shielded pool, they didn't want you to unshield towards a Binance address, because then they're like, oh, well, where did it come from? We can't really say. I mean, yes, we know that it's to this particular account, but we can't show that. So that's something they didn't want. They also didn't want it to go to any sort of like, from Binance into a shielded address, right? The other thing is that they wanted to be able to refund to the address that sent the funds. So like, it's very easy with Bitcoin, right? With Bitcoin or Ethereum, I send an address, I send a deposit in. Everyone can see, yes, address A sent to Binance, right? And if Binance say like, oh, I don't really like the taint of this funds, I'll just return it back straight. And that's easy because we know where the source is. With privacy coins, like for example, Firo, Monero, or like let's say if you're using a Zcash shielded address, you don't have that. You can't return it because the source, the sender is not clear, right? So then they would have to ask the person and say like, hey, can you give us an address to send it back to? And that could be a third-party address, unless you showed a proof of ownership that, yes, I actually control this address. But that's like too much work for an exchange to deal with. Just imagine like, let's say like we're a small coin, then they have to have all this additional compliance tooling to just deal with this. So the easiest way is to say, okay, like force them to just use transparent addresses so that when any sort of deposits go into the exchange, they can just return just like in Bitcoin, right? So what is exchange addresses and tax addresses? So we actually, through negotiations with the legal team and stuff like that, I proposed this idea to say, let's have an address type that's meant for exchanges only. Of course, anyone can generate it, but who would want to generate this? And it will be enforced on the protocol level that it cannot accept any sort of unshieldings directly. It can only accept deposits from a transparent address. So that means that, let's say, if I have funds in a shielded pool or like in Firo Smart pool, I would have to unshield to a transparent address first and then deposit it into Binance, which does at least satisfy the ability to refund because they don't have to ask any sort of ownership proofs and all of that. And it does satisfy like a few things like ability to show transaction history. I would say that's a bit of a gray area, but for the moment that satisfied their requirement. So we actually managed to avoid the delisting then. Zcash still, we got slapped on with a monitoring tag, both with Zcash and yeah, Zcash and Firo, I think were the main ones. Mobilecoin and Monero got delisted. PIVX, for some reason, never had the monitoring tag on. It's all because regulators focus on particular private coins. But obviously, this kind of thing is like, well, it's kind of a trade-off solution. It's not particularly elegant, but it solved the issues of the day and it bought time, right? And obviously, there's certain trade-offs. We obviously prefer to have a privacy on by default, but it allows exchanges to at least operate in a at least a compliant manner that regulators will get off their back for the moment. Another example I would say, as I think that's very gaining traction in the Ethereum space is the idea of privacy pools. And privacy pools are quite simple in this, well, not simple in the sense in the idea that you basically, attaching a ZK proof to say that, yeah, my funds did not come from any of these sanctioned addresses, right? And for example, with Railway, which is the main wallet for Railgun, which also uses privacy pools, it has all this lists like OFAC, Chainalysis, TRM feeds, all these blacklisted addresses. And whenever you deposit, it actually locks your funds for 1 hour before you can do any sort of transactions with it. And obviously, it has the auto return of blacklisted deposits, right? Obviously, there are some concerns here, in the sense that, well, first of all, they call it proof of innocence. That means everyone's assumed to be guilty unless you have this proof of innocence. So there's some philosophical issues there. But at the same time, who controls this list, And these lists are basically controlled by these companies. They have a lot of power. Will it go past that? Maybe they'll start abusing it for other things and doing arbitrary freezes. But look, it's a trade-off, right? And in a way, at least you can say, all right, we prevent the worst actors from using something like Railgun. It can continue to operate without the kind of overheads that Tornado Cash has. So again, I would say a middle kind of solution, which is decent. And actually, the user experience, I don't know if anyone has used privacy pools. I have. I really hate it, but it's a necessary evil. When you click on it, the thing runs, and your computer has to start calculating these proofs of innocence. It can take 20, 30 seconds, and then you wait for it. And every time it syncs, you have to receive these proofs and verify all these things. It's not a great user experience, but if it gets regulators off to say oh yeah, this is kind of all right, okay, I can deal with that. But that's one of the trade-offs. So I guess a lot of people say all right, let's kind of screw compliance. We can deal with our own P2P decentralized methods, right? And a good thought experiment, Monero being the number one, I would say, privacy coin in terms of market cap and maybe even liquidity and adoption. What if it lost all its major centralized exchanges today, right? Obviously, when they lost their Binance listing, it was a big hurrah. Look, we can survive without centralized exchanges. And sure, Binance was a big exchange, but it wasn't the only one. If you take a look, what if it lost KuCoin, HTX, Kraken all at one go? What would actually happen, right? So let's just take a look at this was, I think, taken 2 or 3 days ago. You can see, obviously with decentralized exchanges, some of this are wash trading, right? But let's just take a look with a grain of salt. KuCoin, 42 million, 24-hour volume. And you can see even most of the exchanges here, even if it's a wash trader, it's 3, 4, 5, 6 million, 2 million, all of this. Trade Ogre, 7.5 million, right? So it's quite substantial, right? Now let's compare to the actual P2P options that are being used today for Monero. Like BISC, right? We always talk about using BISC. It's 350 to 650,000. RetoSwap, Havana Reto, usually 150,000. And they had some kind of fee rebate. So recently it's been hitting 1 million to 2 million a day, which is not bad. And Unstoppable Swap, which was oh yeah, atomic swaps on Monero. That's really 20 to 60,000, almost hardly anything. And this is for a multi-billion-dollar market cap coin. Can you say if you lost all these main rails, will this be able to take over? And let's say, okay, even the number one leading one is RetoSwap, Havana Reto right now. This is actually it's not as decentralized as you think it is. There are ways that because the RetoSwap people run the arbitrators, they can actually steal funds. So it's not ideal. Obviously, it'll get better as more people use it, but we are not ready today to move to all these options. I think that's just kind of the point that I'm trying to make. But I'm not trying to scrap on the people who build for the extreme, right? Like projects like Monero, DarkFi, they just say, I'm going to build what's maximal privacy and not care about regulation. And this is actually important in the sense that, look, yes, it may mean that they remain niche, but at the same time, like, for example, something like Tor, right? How many of you actually use Tor on a regular basis? I mean, I use it sometimes, but I would say like, what, once or twice a month or something like that. But it's still, for the people who use it, it's really, really important, right? So as I mentioned there, privacy coins may be a small percentage of that volume, but 100% vital for those people who need to use it, right? And again, we should not be just looking at freedom tag that should be evaluated by, how many users it is, but how does it serve the people that really, really need it? And in a way, by having solutions like this, it also allows us in the middle ground to be like negotiating from a position of strength, to say like, look, if you're going to crack down on us, we're going to go more dark, and then you have zero insight. So like, for example, in like Monero, when a lot of like centralized exchanges, they were, I can't quote who, but there were people that were speaking towards like US regulators. They were saying, well, when we start delisting all these things from the centralized exchanges, we actually lose more sight about what's happening in the Monero ecosystem. When with centralized exchanges, they could still get certain types of information, right? So in a way, they pushing the extreme also makes those in the middle ground in a kind of like better position. So, kudos to them, even if it remains niche, but they have their role to play. So I guess in the end, what I'm trying to say is that, look, we are all building for privacy, right? And we should be championing those that are also fighting in the middle ground, as unsexy as it may become, because it's easier to say max privacy, I don't care, screw the government and stuff like that. It's much more meaningful rather than, let's try to find compromise. That's very unsexy, but that's the reality, right? Reality is that seldom the extremes win. It's always the middle ground that generally gets adoption, right? And sure, we still need the maxis. They are the ones that will be kind of like the backup generator if everything kind of fails, right? They play a very, very important role. So at the end of the day, we are all in the same boat. We are championing different ways to attack the privacy issues, but we're all fighting for the same thing. So we should be cheering everyone on. So yeah, that's, I guess, the main part of my talk over. This is like some of the research that I do. Not I do, my project does. This is where you can find out more about us. We built some cool privacy protocols. And yeah, I just want to remind people that the fight with the Tornado Cash people is not over. I think Alexei Pertsev is still in trouble in the Netherlands. So don't forget about them. Everyone's, especially like the more like, people who don't really follow it say, oh yeah, Tornado Cash thing is solved. No, it's not solved yet. These people are still in trouble. We really wish them the best and continue showing support for them. So that's the main for my talk. If there are any questions, yeah.
Yes, let's give a round of applause for Reuben Yap, guys. Amazing, amazing talk. Man, I really saw that you spoke from the heart there. Very important and very interesting, especially from a privacy and legal standpoint. Thank you much for that. There are two questions that I saw that popped up. One of them was, so how do we work together? For example, with Monero and Bitcoin, how do we work together to make sure that we, can have a better future in that case?
It's not so difficult. Like, for example, Firo and Monero, like at least our research teams have collaborated, and with the privacy protocols, we've discussed ways, even like they have like a working group about policy and stuff like that. Even if we may not totally agree, just having like open dialogues with each other and saying like, okay, this is the things that we're going to pursue. And, if they are supportive of it, I think that's like, it may sound like a bit nebulous. It's more about the small things, like rather than every time when we see a Zcash guy, the Monero people smack, or like with the Zcash, it goes vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And it makes the communities not want to work with each other. So I think just being more decent people, honestly, and there are actually ways to collaborate, like for us.
Okay. So just having to listen to the other party and
like
collaborate.
respect both approaches
Yes,
and not
yes.
like, you know, crap on everything. Yeah.
Second question is that actually someone said most money laundering is also done by SOT KYC details, you know, because at the end of the day, you know, you do KYC, it gets hacked.
Sure.
Russian or North Korean hackers specifically have the, you know, the KYC details, and they can make use of that to create accounts or wherever the case may be, especially with AI, like facial recognition and stuff like that could be easily generated. So, yeah, the whole point of doing KYC then kind of loses its focus. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is also true, but actually the main way for money laundering is not even about KYC thing, it's about trade-based money laundering where there are trillions of dollars, if I'm not mistaken, that goes through trade-based money laundering where you're doing like fake trades and marking up stuff. That's actually the major way to do money laundering. And I don't think KYC solves any of that. But I mean, obviously now you have more intrusive KYC thing. They have the liveness check, they have the facial stuff. That goes some way to mitigating some of this SOT KYC details, but it's still a problem, but I would say it's not the biggest problem for money laundering.
And quickly we can jump on the BTC and Lightning cash. So, yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
I have to admit, I'm not very familiar what cash U is. I mean,
Yeah, me neither. So I don't know who asked the question specifically. But
yeah, but
or you might want to stay anonymous. That's also okay.
I mean, obviously, Lightning Network. I mean, I've tried it. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it doesn't. And I think, as Joe said, you know, like they've had many, many years to get it right. I mean, even the original Lightning developers didn't design it for it to be. It was just meant to be like some, okay, you know, I'm going to make repeated payments, and then I expanded this use case, but it wasn't the one-size-fits-all that it is meant to be. And I think the sooner that we are more honest about Lightning limitations, the better we can move on. Not to say that Lightning isn't good tech, it's just that we have to realize its limitation. It doesn't solve everything. Even like, you know, the privacy stuff, it's not perfect, yeah.
All right, that's all the questions that we have. Please, guys, give a round of applause to Reuben Yap once again.